Welcome to The Mything Link, a podcast where we explore the undercurrent of mythology that links our modern culture to our ancient stories.
We're your hosts, Dr. Caitlinn
And Dr. Randall,
two professional mythologists who share a passion for music,
a proclivity for all things spooky,
and an insatiable curiosity for the world around us.
The show will cover worldwide mythology, and season 1 will focus on ancient Greek stories,
giving listeners everything they need to know to understand the new Netflix series Chaos.
And most likely several things that they don't. Join us as we talk, laugh, and sing this fall for The Mything Link season 1.
Chaos
Theory. You can link that up. It's appropriately chaotic. This whole situation is appropriately chaotic. Maybe that's it. It's a lesson in chaos. Perfect.
It's a lesson in chaos theory.
All right, everybody. Welcome to the Mything Link. Woo, woo, woo. Today, we're just going to do a little mini episode to introduce the concept of mythology. So we really recommend listening to this episode in its entirety before any of the other episodes or any of the other seasons, just to get an understanding of what we mean by mythology. Because I don't know about you, Caitlin, but I have so many folks come to me with misconceptions about what mythology is and why we should care about it. Oftentimes, folks, they understand myth as the opposite of truth, when in reality, a myth is a story. And I like to define mythology based on the definition that in the book Ishmael by Daniel Quinn, he gives a definition kind of about what mythology is, or like a cultural story. And it's a story that a culture tells itself that it believes to be true. And so there's no like inherent true or falseness to it, because the story has power because people act as if it is true. So the belief itself is what's important in mythology. So mythology could come to us from an undefined source or a clearly defined source if people believe it's true.
I really like that. I was thinking while you were talking that one of the ways that I personally define mythology is kind of in context to one of the liberation psychologists. He talks about like communal knowledge as a valid epistemology. And I think oftentimes of mythology as a communal epistemology of sorts. And exactly what you're saying, it's like, it's a truth. And it's true, but it's not necessarily historically accurate. And I don't think that because something's not historically accurate nullifies the complexity of its truth. And so for me, coming from a specifically Christian background, where I was taught that the Bible is the literal word of God, I think that actually really damages a lot of the myth in the Bible, because the reality is that even if these stories aren't historically true, they still have power. They had power and meaning making for the ancient Israelites and for the ancient Greco-Romans, and arguably people and Christians now, if they want. But making those enlightenment-flavored rituals, that's not mythology, that's not story, that's theology.
There's a clear differentiation here between theology and mythology. And what we're going to be talking about this season will absolutely have some overlap with theology and religious studies. But really, we're going to be looking at stories. And to me, like, this is I always say that this feels really dramatic, but mythology is a matter of life and death. And I feel like so often I have to defend my PhD because people are like, oh, you're not a real doctor, right? Like you're just a doctor of stories. And sure, I'm not a medical doctor. I make no claims to be a medical doctor, but stories are literally a matter of life and death. Like we have laws based on the stories we tell. People are murdered in wars, in face-to-face, like on the micro level, and on the macro level, based on the stories we tell about who deserves access to what resources, right? Like the stories we tell have such an impact. I mean, look at the difference between, off the top of my head, because I'm a mom, like maternal health care rates, maternal mortality rates for women of color or women who don't have the economic status to access proper care here in our country. Like that's because of specific stories that are told about who deserves access to what and what our responsibility is to each other as humans. So mythology also serves to teach people who they are and what their relationship is with each other and the world around them.
It's a form of sense making. Those stories are a form of self-understanding and behavioral understanding and cultural understanding. And I think we really do ourselves a disservice when we don't at least acknowledge that storytelling is also a valid epistemology.
Let's define epistemology for folks.
A valid way of knowing something, a valid way of understanding the world around you, or just general sense making.
So perhaps like a framework through which to view the world or understand the world.
Right. Sure.
Okay.
Stories are like when I think of what you're describing, like history in the textbooks is always through the lens of the victor, right? And so that mythology, that storytelling has created a framework of understanding or holding power and creating discrepancies and at the same time, storytelling can also be a really healing thing for people who are at the other end of that. I don't know where I was going with that. I got derailed.
Hey, it was all good information. But wherever you were going, it made me think that propaganda and like because history is written by the victors, oftentimes our mythology can be defined by the victors. And that includes propaganda. It includes advertisements, like especially in our modern culture today. We have a ton of traditions that come to us from advertisement, like what Santa Claus looks like largely was influenced by his outfit in old Coca-Cola ads in the 50s. Is it the 50s? First half of the 1900s.
I was just thinking of the commercials.
Yeah, but like these ideas, like so we do have like secular cultural mythologies, and those can be just as powerful as religious mythologies. And in this show, we're not going to be making any sort of claims on what you should believe or what the truth is. Like we will be talking about these stories as they were understood and utilized by the cultures who created them, and also how those stories have grown and changed. Because one thing about mythology is it changes based on who's telling the story and who's receiving the story. Like your favorite game of telephone in elementary school, like good juicy gossip, the details always change. And that's something that used to really frustrate me about mythology, because I wanted to like get to the source of what people actually believed. But that's the beauty of mythology, is that so many of these traditions are oral traditions, and it grew and it morphed and it changed. And then we started writing it down, and the act of writing it down like froze it in time. And that's something we'll be exploring throughout the season as well.
That's one of my favorite things about mythology, actually, is how it's not binary, and how it, like, even you and I hearing the same story, or
is mythology woke?
On the same details.
Are you claiming that mythology is non-binary?
It's woke. Oh shit! So woke.
Mythology is breaking the binary.
Randall, spoiler alert. Half our listeners.
Bye. Spoiler alert. Mythology is queer as fuck. Queer as fuck. Especially ancient Greek mythology. And sorry. We're going to be talking about lots of.
I mean, wasn't that why everybody was super offended about the Olympics? Because it was
real gay.
I mean, yeah, but it changes and can change to meet and be met by whoever needs to hear what it has to say. Let it come to you is my advice for anybody listening to this. Take what you will, and take what reaches out to you. Take what reveals itself to you, because that's the beauty of mythology.
That is the beauty of mythology. It just, yes.
I've always loved it because there's no like right and wrong. But I know people, while you were saying that, it drives you crazy. I'm like, yes, let's have all the tensions at the same time. Don't make me pick.
Well, no. that's something that I really was forced to confront and learn throughout my the journey of my PhD, because I come from a background in anthropology. Archaeology was my specific concentration in my bachelor's degree. And while that's an art and humanity in one sense, like it's also a science, and it really spoke to my, little autistic heart that everything could be categorized and like tested, and data points could be collected. And I came into this PhD in mythology like expecting more of the same. And I remember the first paper I wrote for the great Chris Downing, she just blasted me because she's like, yeah, precious angel. But she was also like, okay, and what about you? How do you feel? What's your engagement with the myth? And I was writing about Demeter and Persephone. And I was like, my understanding and engagement with the myth doesn't matter. Like I'm citing my sources. I'm telling you what the scholars say. Like this is an academic paper. And I didn't know how to write an academic paper about my feelings. And that was a really, really intense journey for me throughout
that was really confronting to me about Chris Downing as well.
Yeah. She's a spitfire, man. I want to talk a little bit about the background of mythology, or the word mythology, and where we get this idea that it equates to falsehood. So it comes to us from where a lot of things come to us from. Good old Paul in the New Testament. Thanks, Paul.
I have beef with Paul.
Yeah, sorry, I've got beef with Paul too. I've got beef with Saul too. I mean, I don't know, so here, 1 Timothy chapter 4. So Timothy reports that Paul says, have nothing to do with godless myths and old wives' tales. Rather, train yourself to be godly. So the idea there is that myths are equated with false gods, with anti-Christianity, with fill in the blank here that goes against Paul's teachings on Christ. And that word, just for story, got equated with falsehood because they're talking specifically about the false stories. Do you have any?
I mean, this would have been at the time of the gods that we're about to be talking about in chaos theory. They're trying to differentiate Jesus from the Olympian gods and repeatedly asserting Paul is trying to lessen the power that the pantheon has by making Jesus seem different, and all at the same time disparaging the normal Greco-Roman religious hierarchy. I mean, it's very political of Paul.
Yeah, what isn't political about Paul?
Well, it's not political. Never mind. We don't have to get into that now. You are correct. Just rein it in there.
Woo. There's also a passage in the Bible that says, you shall not put other gods before me, which some interpret. I'm sorry, I don't know the exact chapter and verse of that.
It's Exodus 20. It's the 10 Commandments. But basically the idea is that in acknowledging you should not have other gods before me, there is an acknowledgement that other gods exist.
Right. Basically, Exodus 20.
And that's actually like pretty harmonious with most of the Old Testament. You actually have, like in the beginning of Job, you have Ha-Satan, the adversary, in the court of Yahweh. Or like El Shaddai, the many-breasted God. Or Ruach Elohim is the plural feminine divine in the Old Testament. Or there's so many examples of El, the reference to El in terms of like the names for God in the Old Testament is taken from a far older series of gods, Baal, Shemem, all of the like Sumerian and
right.
Canaanite
so there's reason
divinities.
To believe, like historically speaking, that as these stories were being written down by the Hebrews who would become the first Christians, that they, or told, I guess I shouldn't say written down, but as these stories were basically the implication from the text is that the ancient Hebrews who would become the first Christians, as they were telling these stories, were not only aware of other religions around them that worship different gods, but didn't necessarily say that those gods weren't real, just that their God was their main God, which is the same idea we see throughout antiquity,
Yes.
right? Like, and even today, like with the Hindu
Yes.
pantheon, many regions will have one specific god or goddess or figure that they elevate around above the others because of their geographic location or whatever it is. And we see that throughout around the world, throughout the ancient world.
Right.
So this idea that mythology is bad and anti-Christian is inherently false. And throughout the season, we're going to be using mythology in the academic context to specifically refer to those stories, both religious and non-religious. And when we talk about Christian stories or Islamic stories or Jewish stories, we're going to refer to those as mythology as well, because we're referring to the stories that followers, believers, people in that culture believe to be true. So just want to like get all those disclaimers out of the way. We're not trying to say that any modern religious tradition is relegated to the status of mythology as falsehood. We're saying that every religious tradition around the world in ancient times and in modernity all contain, secular and religious, like contain mythology. And that's what we're going to be exploring together. Fair?
A universalist of you, Randall.
Thanks. And we didn't even mention one of the really cool, oh, that's what I wanted to say. We were talking about mythology and propaganda and advertisements and all of that. And I wanted to make a really important distinction that folklore is part of mythology, but the difference with folklore is, like, if we break down the word, right, it's this folk, the people, the stories of the people. And so folklore often comes to us from the ground up, where mythology can come to us from the top down. But mythology encompasses all of it, because a folk tale like Little Red Riding Hood, it doesn't have to have inherent truth in order to teach a lesson and to be true.
Right.
Because what does Little Red teach us in her story? Like, stay
how
on
to
the
confront
path.
your fairy tales are to help children confront their darkest of fears in a relatively safe way. That's why the original Grimm's tales and all those folklores are actually like pretty grotesque, so that kids can learn these life lessons and how to handle fears appropriately in the context of processing through stories.
Yeah, absolutely. It lets folks and the same way that movies and TV shows and stories do today, they allow us to experience things outside of our norm and maintain a safe distance that's reasonable for us to have these emotional experiences and practice them before these situations come up in our life. And it serves a really, really important function in that way. So I'm sure we'll be talking about some folk tales throughout probably this season, and subsequent seasons as well. So I just wanted to make sure we had that definition. Cool. Well, thanks so much for joining us today. We're really excited to continue our journey exploring the mything links through season 1, Chaos Theory. And we'll see you next time for an overview and introduction of one Mr. Prometheus, the narrator of Chaos. Till next time.
We should come up with like a witty closing statement.
I was thinking that, like,
we are the missing link.
Stay mythy. That, but... Oh, you are the missing link. Goodbye. Not too dated? Are we fucking old people? Thanks for listening to The Mything Link. You can find the reference list in the show notes for further research. The Mything Link is researched and recorded by Drs. Randall Ulyate and Caitlinn Curry. Edited by Dr. Caitlinn Curry. With music by Mark Austin Kelton. The Mything Link is produced by Fernway Collective Incorporated, a humanities nonprofit based in San Diego, California. As a small nonprofit, we appreciate if you have the time to leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts to help grow our audience. For more information on our organization, head over to fernwaycollective.org. Thanks for listening.
Wonder if it's because I have a lot of tabs open.
Probably. Close our tabs, fool.